Hey, welcome to How to Play, brought to you by the Games Capital and Good Games. Today we're looking at the game Tiny Towns, which is all about building a village or a little town in a forest. The game's for 2 to 6 players. It has a very puzzly element as you try and make the best use of the space in your town square or town area. Before we get into the rules though, let's have a look at what's in the box. Alright, so there's lots of wooden pieces in this game. We have a whole heap of resource cubes. These are in 5 different colours representing the 5 different building types. So we've got, there's wood, there's wheat, there is brick, glass and also stone. So all of those pieces are going to be used to construct the various buildings in the town, which are over here. So we've got all these little wooden buildings in different colours that represent the different types of buildings that you're going to be able to build in your town. We have cards, so at the moment I've got laid out 7 cards which represent the 7 buildings that are going to be able to be built in this particular game, but there is a whole deck of cards with a whole heap of different buildings that all do slightly different things. So every game you're going to have a different combination of buildings and they interact slightly differently. As well as that, there's another deck of cards which have a pink back. These are the monuments in the game. So more on that in a moment, but each player will get to choose from 2 of those monument cards, and in addition to that each player gets 1 monument piece that they'll be able to build as potentially as well. Player board, so everyone has one of these 4x4 player boards which represents the area that their town is going to be built in, and the last piece is the hammer, which is the start player token. So whoever has that is the start player for that round, and this gets passed between players. Alright, so that's all the pieces for Tiny Towns. Let's get into how we play. So to set up a game of Tiny Towns, you're going to need 7 building cards to be placed in the middle of the table. So what you'll do is you'll grab the building deck. Each of the different building types have a different colour on the back, so you'll randomly select 1 from each of the different types of buildings and place them out in the middle of the table. They're going to be the buildings for that round, and as I said before, they're all a little bit different and they interact differently with the other cards or the other buildings in the town. So that's the first thing you do. You'll set that up and place all of the timber pieces so that they're easy to reach for everybody. Then each player will receive 2 of these monument cards from which they will select 1 to keep. And that will be 1 unique building that only they will be able to build during the course of the game. So everyone will have a different one of those. Alright, so then you'll choose a start player, give that person the hammer, and you're ready to go. Alright, so the main idea of this game is to get these buildings onto your player board to create your town. So to do that, you need to collect building resources in order to build the building. So each of these building cards, as you see, has a different combination of resources in a specific pattern. So in this instance, there is a kind of an L-shaped pattern of brick, glass and wheat. So in order to build the cottage, you would need to recreate that pattern on your player board by collecting the appropriate resources and placing them in the right space. So each square on your board can hold 1 resource cube. These patterns can be mirrored, flipped, any combination basically. You just need to make sure that the pattern is the same. So in this case, the glass cube needs to be in the corner and the other 2 forming that L shape. Once you get that on the board, you can then potentially build the appropriate building. Alright, so that's the basic concept of how the game works, how you're going to get buildings onto the board. Let's see how the game actually plays though now. Alright, so Tiny Towns is really very simple. Each turn, whoever the player with the hammer, who is the master builder for that round, chooses 1 resource type out of the 5. So for example, let's say I'm the master builder and I take timber. All the other players will also take one timber cube, and everyone will place that timber somewhere in their town. Once a cube is placed, it can no longer be moved, so you've got to think of it carefully, and obviously what you're trying to recreate is some kind of pattern. But when you're the master builder, you have control over what resource is selected. Once you've done that, you also then have the option, if you qualify to build one of these buildings, so if you've created the correct pattern, you can then construct one of these buildings. So for example, if I'd managed to get this pattern here, which is a stone and a wood, which matches the pattern for the well, at the end of my turn, I could opt to build that building. So I would take the well piece, and then I would take these two resource cubes off, return them to the supply, and I would need to build that on one of the squares that I used for that particular pattern, and I would place that on the board. Now, placement is important because you don't want to block yourself from creating other patterns, and also some of the cards require certain buildings to be built near other buildings or in rows and columns in order to earn points. So depending on what's happening during the game, that may also affect where you place your building. So that's basically it. That's the turn. If you're the master builder, you choose a resource, everybody takes the same resource, places it on, everyone can build if they want to. If not, then you pass the hammer to the next player and the process is repeated. Very simple. The game continues until everybody has finished building, but we'll have a little closer look at that in a moment. Before we do, let's have just a look at these particular buildings, which are the suggested buildings for the first game that you play, just to give you a bit of an idea of how the game works. Right, so we've got 7 buildings. These are the buildings suggested for the first game that you play. As I mentioned before, once you're familiar with the game, you're going to have different combinations of buildings and they will interact differently. But just to give you an idea of how they work, the cottage is the first building, and whenever you see this little symbol here, it's a little green symbol which represents points. So what this building does, it earns 3 points if the building is fed. So the idea or the concept of being fed is something you'll see on various cards. In order for a building to be fed, it needs another building that will feed it, and we'll see how that works in a moment with the farm. But for every one of these buildings that you have that is fed, you will earn 3 points. The chapel is the next building. Once again, it has a point symbol. In this instance, it's 1 point, and this earns you 1 point for every cottage, which was the previous card, that you have fed. So they kind of work together. You want to feed the cottages in order for you to earn points. Then the chapels will also earn you an additional point for every cottage that you manage to feed on the board. The farm, here's the card or the building that allows you to feed other buildings. So in this instance, it says it feeds 4 of a particular type of building, has this little symbol. Well, the cottage has that symbol. Some other buildings also have that symbol. It will feed 4 buildings anywhere in your town. So as long as you have 1 farm, it will feed 4 cottages and earn each of those cottages points. Now, some of the other cards in the building, in the deck rather, require different placement. They'll only earn points or only feed buildings that they're adjacent to and such. So there's different ways that can work. In this case, any building, it will feed 4 anywhere in your town. The tavern. So here, the tavern allows you to earn points based on other taverns that you've built. So the more taverns you built, up to 5, the more points you will earn. And there's a little scale at the bottom showing for every tavern, you're going to earn X amount of points, up to 5. The most you can have is 5. So that's quite simple. Then we have the well. The well earns you 1 point for every adjacent cottage. So if you have 1 well in the middle with 4 cottages on each point or each edge, then that will earn 4 points, that particular well. So you can see how you could combine those 2 cards. The theatre, once again, 1 point for each other unique building in the same row and column as the theatre. So here's where placement becomes important, because the more unique buildings you have in the row and column that the theatre is in, the more points it's worth. So You can plan for that. And the last one is the factory, which is a little bit interesting. This says when you construct the factory, you take one of the 5 resource cubes and you place it on top of the factory, and it actually will sit nicely there. And then for the remainder of the game, when anyone names that particular resource type, you can choose to place a different type of resource if you want. So you're not restricted when someone calls stone and that doesn't quite suit what you're planning. You can choose a different resource. So for every factory that you've got on the board, you can do that. All right, so they are the starting buildings, or the buildings for the first game, but as I said, there's a whole heap of different variations of those same types of things happening, and each game will be slightly different, and I'll let you discover those on your own. And that basically is the concept of Tiny Towns. So let's have just a chat in a moment about how the game ends. Right, so basically the game is going to continue in that same pattern of master builder choosing resource, everybody placing, potentially building. At some point, your board is going to get to a situation where you can no longer place anything that will allow you to build a building because it's either full or it doesn't allow you to get the pattern that you need. You might have cubes on there that don't work. Anyway, at some point, you can no longer place. At that point, you're finished. Your town is done. But the other players continue until there's one player left. That player also continues until he has completed his town or built as much as he can, and then the game ends. To score, you'll remove at that point all of the cubes that you've still got on the board, and then you'll grab the score sheet, which there is a pad hiding in the box here somewhere, which allows you to score on. So for each building type, depending on the cards that are in play, they'll potentially score you points. So you'll figure out which of those buildings earns you which points based on how you've built. Your monument card, if you've managed to build that, might earn you bonus points as well. And then for every empty square on your board, you lose a point, and whoever has the most score, whoever has the highest score is the winner. In summary, each round the Master Builder will select a resource type. All players must place the resource in a square on their board. Then all players have the option to construct any buildings they qualify for, removing all cubes and placing the building in place of one of the cubes. When a player can no longer place cubes or construct buildings, their game is finished. When all players are finished, remove all leftover cubes and score. The player with the highest score is the winner. Well, Tiny Towns is an awesome game. It's very fast-paced, very quick, not a lot of downtime. Each turn goes very quickly. You choose a resource, decide whether you want to build, and then suddenly it's the next turn. So there's not a lot of waiting around. The game is different every turn, as I've said, with the different buildings. Different combinations are going to make the game fresh each time you play. So if you like the building puzzly concept within a game, then you're bound to love Tiny Towns. Check it out. Okay, thanks for watching. Happy gaming.